So you know what happens to a big thing when it gets really big with the kiddies? Somebody has the bright idea to make a movie out of it. And well, once upon a time they sorta did. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie was released in 1995 to cash in on the phenomenon that had been on fire since its debut in 1993. And the movie was alright. You know, it had its issues. The CGI was not all that great. You know, and there was continuity issues and whatnot. But I liked it back then. And even today, I don't think it's such a bad flick. It's a pretty decent flick for the most part. Certainly, there have been much worse movies out there. Now, what happens when a movie like this does good numbers? Somebody has the bright idea of making video games out of it, and well, here's one of them.
The first positive I have to say about Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie, the game for the Sega Genesis, is that each Ranger has their own unique sprite set and resembles the way they did in the television show. So in other words, no palette swapped Red Ranger or disproportionate steroid Rangers to be found here. And thank God for that. Of course, they all fight pretty much the same way, with perhaps a couple unique moves among them, at best, and they all share the same voice depending on the gender, but it's still a far cry from what we got the first time on Genesis and even on the Super Nintendo offerings. So with that out of the way, let's begin the review proper of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, the movie, the game for Sega Genesis, and I will spare you the use of that particular title and just go with the proper title, so let's just keep going. Now, much like the first batch of Power Ranger video games released in 1994, Sega developed and published games based on the Power Rangers movie for both the Genesis and the Game Gear, thankfully sparing us another Sega CD outing of horrible full-motion video gaming comprising QuickTime events over recycled TV footage that looks far worse than whatever you'd find on YouTube. While Bandai delivered the goods for Super Nintendo and Game Boy. While the Game Gear version of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie is virtually the same game as its predecessor, the Genesis iteration veers away from the one-on-one fighting genre and goes for a traditional side-scrolling beat-em-up akin to Final Fight or Sega's own Streets of Rage series. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie features the Rangers fending off against the forces of Ivan Ooze and preventing his takeover of the world. Unlike the Super Nintendo version of the same name, which has very little to do with the actual movie outside of the titular villain, Ivan Ooze, being the final boss of the game, the Genesis iteration of Power Rangers the movie does attempt to follow the movie a lot more closely, by having you fight Oozemen and Ectomorphic and Titans, which were enemies featured from the movie and not featured in the Super Nintendo version, by the way. However, the game skips over most of the movie and just portrays the Ranger fights. The entire middle portion of the movie has been depicted in cutscenes. To make up for this fact, however, there is a scene in the game where the three new Rangers at the time, Rocky, Aisha, Adam, reminisce about how they first started, resulting in a flashback and a couple levels taking place during the second season of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. I'll admit that this is a rather nice way of tying the TV show to the movie, which normally has nothing to do with each other as far as continuity goes, and it does give some excuse to shoehorn putties and fights with Goldar and other monsters into the game. Although I was initially thrilled about having the prospect of reliving TV show episodes in the game entitled Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the Movie, after my experiences with the Super Nintendo game of the same name. Eventually it grew on me, it didn't really bother me as much, and in fairness, the Game Gear version also did the same thing, albeit in a different fashion, but still the same deal. Whereas the previous Sega offerings had rather generic and unimpressive soundtrack, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie takes its cues from the TV show by recreating some of the classic Ron Wasserman fight music into Genesis theme. And all in all, the sounds are rather respectful renditions of the TV show soundtrack and pretty good in their own right, which is a step above the previous Genesis offering. The rendition of the classic Go-Go Power Rangers theme song is still rather weak, in my opinion. But in fairness, it's actually a pretty decent rendition, and it's a far better rendition than what was available in the first Power Rangers game on Genesis, which was god-f***ing awful. So what's the gameplay like? Well, like I said, it's a beat-em-up akin to Streets of Rage or Final Fight. You have several moves, including a generic life-draining special move, a unique special move that is done by charging your attack button, and your usual assortment of basic punch-kick combo attacks and grapple moves. Nothing too fancy here. For the most part, your main opponents will be Oozemen and Putty Patrollers. On occasion, Goldar will swoop down and beat you up a bit. You could always return the favor, and at the end of most levels, you'll face a boss, beat him, and face him again in your Megazord. The availability of Zords depends on the scenario taking place. You have no lives count, only limited continues, but you can gain lots of lives and more continues by collecting power coins that will pop out at times depending on whether at times. It usually appears at the same time, so it doesn't really matter. Other than that, it's your typical side-scrolling beat 'em up. There's destructible environments, the occasional passing car you have to avoid, lest you want to get killed, or at least heavily damaged. Meteors you have to avoid, and a hidden fight with Lord Zed, but it's typical beat 'em up fare. The game is a bit on the easy side. It doesn't really get challenging unless you set the difficulty to hard, and even then you probably lose a continue or two at worst before beating the game in no time. With only 6 levels, it's a fairly quick game, so chances are you should beat this in less than an hour or so. If that. Now, I've heard opinions, people saying that this is probably the best of the Mighty Morphin offerings that you can find. Indeed, it probably has some claim to that. Sticks to the source material, easy to get into, fun time with a second player. However, I'd have to say this is probably the second best Mighty Morphin offering. The best offering of the early Mighty Morphin Power Rangers games, in my opinion at least, happened to be the first Game Gear release, as it's a rather slick and enjoyable game to play. But that would be harder to come across, and probably harder to play for long periods considering the Game Gear's reputation as a power sucker. Still, despite that, this game, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie, for the Genesis, is probably as close as you're going to get to a Power Rangers game that captures the feel and essence of the television series, if not the movie, and for that, it's worth a shot if you're a fan of this show.
Refresher, these are the Power Rangers as they appeared in the movie, and this was their usual appearance on the TV show. The pretty big difference there. Despite this, though, you would expect the game's storyline to follow that of the feature film, since it is called Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. But as is most certainly not the case. Yes, there is Ivan Ooze, the movie's villain, and yes, he is the main villain in this game. But no, this has nothing to do with the movie. Instead, it's more like a game based on the TV show's second season, featuring putties and a number of second season monsters like Silverhorns and the like. Now, under normal circumstances, that's not much of a problem. If you want to make a sequel to the old MMPR game, that's fine. But if you're going to name it after the movie, then the smart thing would be to follow the movie instead of having nothing to do with the movie whatsoever. Yes, there have been some movie-related games that had nothing to do with the movie they were based on, but this is stretching it somewhat. Now, I think what may have happened, and this is just an assumption on my part, I don't know if this is really the case, was that this was originally intended to be a sequel to the original MMPR game on the SNES with no ties to the movie whatsoever, and instead of Ivan Ooze as the final boss, you'd be facing Lord Zed. Maybe even Rita Repulsa, it's a bit of a stretch. But when the movie came along, they decided to adjust it so it ties in with the movie, so instead of whoever was supposed to be the final boss originally, you'd have Ivan Ooze. But the game has nothing to do with the movie. In any case, it's just a theory on my part, and maybe there's some other story to it. But I digress. In any case, Mighty Morphin the movie, much like the previous Mighty Morphin game, is a combination side-scrolling beat-em-up platformer where you must guide your Power Ranger through 7 levels of fighting a variety of enemies, overcoming obstacles, and navigating the level to the end boss. It's pretty much the same format as before, but there are some changes to the overall gameplay mechanics. First off, you have a slow, fierce attack as opposed to rapid-fire combinations as is the case with the previous game. This means enemies take a hit or two to be destroyed as opposed to a quick combo or two. In addition to the default punch attack, you also have a crouching attack, an aerial attack, a strong attack, and finally a unique special move for each teenager. The special move requires a bit of energy from your power meter to be performed, so if you don't have enough energy, you can't pull off the move. Speaking of which, you fill up the power meter by collecting bolts and filling up the meter, which will allow you to morph into a Power Ranger. You can morph at any point in the stage you wish, a step up from the previous game, which only lets you morph upon reaching a pre-designated point in the stage. But if you make it to a boss unmorph, you'll morph automatically anyway, so whatever. So now that the automated instruction manual is out of the way, I should probably discuss the other major change to the game, your health meter. In the previous game you had a long meter which allowed you to take many hits. If your life meter was full and you picked up a health item, the meter would change color from green to blue to purple, allowing you to take even more hits. In Power Rangers the movie, you were stuck with a short meter comprising 5 hit points. Most enemies will kill you in 5 hits, although some stronger attacks will take 2 points off the meter. This makes the game a tad harder than the previous game, and it's no walk in the park on its own merits either, with some unique challenges such as the riding train, snowboarding segments, and the weapons complex. The limited number of continues and the removal of a password function does raise the challenge level somewhat, but it's not nearly as impossible as a few might suspect. At best, it's a fairly standard curve of difficulty. And if you do find a game a bit too easy, you could always try the hard mode. That'll give you a decent challenge. And while we're at it, let's talk about the levels in Power Rangers the movie, which are quite a bit more diverse than the previous title. Starting off on the streets of Angel Grove, you move forward to a battleship, snowboarding down a slope, riding a high-tech train, and invading a high-tech facility where you have to dodge launching missiles. I rather like the variety in locales, and it's fun to see the Rangers fight in other places that wouldn't have been possible with the meager budget or the limited footage of the old TV show. If nothing else, it just expands on that universe a whole lot more than what could have been done back in the day.
or even today for that matter, all things considered. It should be noted before I forget that the game boasts two-player co-op, something that the previous game lacked. Of course, that means that two people will probably expend the meager number of continues much more quickly than just one person would. Also, there are no Megazord sequences in the game, none whatsoever. I guess they're saving that for another game, but I digress. The graphics in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie is similar in quality to the original Mighty Morphin game that preceded this one, in some cases a tad better. It seems a bit more colorful in some cases, but it's not too notable of an improvement if you don't pay attention all that much. Maybe it's just a bit of polish at some points, but for the most part this game looks good. Unfortunately, they kept the Steroid Rangers from the previous game, all of whom still look awkward and ridiculous. Even the White Ranger looks marginally normal compared to the others, so... On the other hand, the morphing sequences look really nice in this game. It's brief, but it looks good, and it sort of matches what you see on the old shows, so there's that. The sound is fairly average stuff, nothing really special. The soundtrack's pretty decent, with the later stages having some really neat kick-ass music that gets you in the mood, but are complemented with sound effects that almost seem inferior to the sounds used in the previous game, if that was even possible. The traditional Go-Go Power Rangers theme song is of lesser quality here than the previous game, which boasted a near-faithful rendition of the theme, but aside from that, it's alright, I guess. Nothing noteworthy, nothing cringe-inducing, so I can't really complain. On a whole, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie the game for the Super Nintendo is a fairly competent game. Sure, its title may be deceptive, and its attempt to follow the movie that it's supposedly based on is non-existent, but putting that aside, what you have is a decent, not great, but a decent beat-em-up platformer, although it certainly could have been a bit better than it is. Not as bad as people make it out to be, it's certainly worth a look if you're into Power Rangers and can find a cheap copy somewhere, although truth be told, despite the two-player mode and diverse level design, if given the choice, I'd stick with the first game since it's an overall better game, but hey, this one ain't too bad either. Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie the game for the Game Boy. It sounds awkward. I don't know why they do it. Anyways. Coinciding with the release of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie, the first one from '95, were a bunch of video games for the popular 16-bit and handheld video game systems of the time. Now, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie was handled differently on the various platforms. The Sega offerings, the Genesis and the Game Gear, opted to divide the game between following a brief portion of the movie and reliving events from the second season of the Mighty Morphin show. The Super Nintendo version was mainly a follow-up to the first Super Nintendo game and pitted you against putties and monsters from the second season, having little to do with the movie outside of the title and the final boss fight with Ivan Ooze, who served as something of a stand-in for Lord Zed in this game. I don't know, maybe he was regenerating or something, or he was too busy getting married. Wait. The Game Boy version, on the other hand, is something of a hybrid. While the game doesn't necessarily follow the plot of the movie per se, it does feature more elements from the movie than the other games did, which mostly borrowed from the television show. Aside from Ivan Ooze, who is once again the final boss, the game also features Mordant, a monster created for the movie, a Tengu warrior, a monster that never even made it to the other games, the Rat Creature, which was intended to be in the movie but was ultimately dumped and instead used on the show in the three-part episode Return of the Green Ranger, the one where the White Ranger fought the Green Ranger in a less than stellar battle. But I digress. And most notably, the Rangers are playable in both Ninja Ranger garb and the more armor-like movie suits as opposed to the more well-known spandex TV show suits that were used in the other games. This is especially evident with the helmet shots, which are modeled more after the movie versions than the TV ones. All of this results in a Game Boy game that closely matches the tonality of the movie, if nothing else, and makes it something of a unique Power Rangers offering, for the time at least. So let's get to the game itself. When you first start off, you get to pick a level to challenge. There are 5 levels accessible from the start, with a 6th unlocked once you clear the rest. I generally go with Mordant, Tengu, Rat, Goldar, and Lord Zed, but the truth is you could go any order you wish. It really doesn't matter. It's sort of like Mega Man, except without the ability to steal boss weapons, which would have made the game a little cooler, but I digress. Once you pick a stage, you pick a ranger. Some rangers jump higher, others hit somewhat harder, but for the most part, they all play the same way, and unless you're playing this on the Super Game Boy, which adds more color, it really doesn't matter. You start the game off in Ninja Ranger garb and can perform basic punches and kicks. As you defeat putties and other enemies, you'll slowly build up your power meter. Once the meter's full, you press select to morph into your ranger suit and get a spiffy new dash attack and more attack power. If you desire, you can go through the level in Ninja Ranger garb, but once you reach a certain point, the game will force you to fight putties forever until you morph before you meet up with the stage boss. Power Rangers the movie on Game Boy takes its cue from the original Mighty Morphin game for Super Nintendo, essentially a side-scrolling beat-em-up with platforming elements. While you don't have any exceptional moves such as wall jumping or weapons, you do have a bomb attack that clears the screen or damages a boss when you fill your power meter in morphed form. For the most part, the game plays rather well, controls rather decent and somewhat responsive, but there are a couple issues that I've noticed. Specifically, the basic attack scheme is something you have to be wary of. The B button is your attack button and will cause your ranger to execute a punch or kick attack. Now I think there's a specific pattern to which attack will execute, and it's not something you could determine yourself with specific commands. This can cause combat in some areas to be problematic at best. The best example would be this particular portion of the mine level, where you'd have to destroy the barricade bit by bit before the putty crushes you. When you figure out the pattern, you can do this quickly enough, but sometimes you'll forget, you'll have a lapse of judgment, and it will happen, let me assure you that. And this will often do you in. God knows how many times I got killed here as a result of this. Also, at certain times, I've noticed a delay in the jumping. Specifically, I would press right and A to jump across a pit, because there are pits in this game. But sometimes, instead, I would just fall into the pit with the jump never having registered. As a result, I would have to jump straight up before moving in midair to the platform I want to reach. This is a rather lousy way of navigating a chasm of narrow platforms, and is certainly a sign of bad control issues. As a whole, though, it's not so bad, and it's not necessarily a contributing factor to the game's overall difficulty. And the game does pose quite a bit of challenge, whether it be from the bosses, the tricky platforming, or the irritatingly spotty collision detection that will have a hard time detecting collision of any kind half the time. That's something you want to underestimate in a Power Rangers game which features lots of punching and kicking and relies on collision to get the job done. Graphic-wise, this is something of an improvement over the previous Game Boy Power Rangers, whose graphics were pretty basic and bland. Power Rangers the movie boasts considerably detailed level design, and the Ranger sprites, both in ninja garb and armored movie suits, look really nice, for the most part. The bosses look alright for the most part, and some of the minor enemies in this game are also neatly designed, but it seems they just recycled the same putty sprites from the previous game. Either that or they just rushed those guys out. I have a hard time telling whether they're supposed to be the Z putties from the second season or the old school putties that Rita used to use in the original first season. Oh well, in either case, the game's nicer looking than before, especially when played on the Super Game Boy accessory, where the color palette changes depending on the ranger you picked. Sound in this game's pretty average. Everything sounds like what it should, in terms of punches thrown, attacks landed, and whatnot. I kinda dig some of the tunes in this game, but sadly they butchered the Go-Go Power Rangers theme song. It sounds pretty dreadful here. Shameful. In general, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie for the Game Boy is probably the closest you're going to get in playing a game that matches the tonality of the movie it's based on. It has movie suits, it has ninja suits, it has some of the minor villains aside from Avian Ooze, and it doesn't try to shoehorn itself into TV continuity like the other Mighty Morphin Power Ranger movie games did. Setting that aside, the game is a tremendous improvement over the initial Game Boy offering, with more varied and interesting gameplay and better presentation overall. However, the hit detection and lack of variation between the 6 Rangers prevent it from being anything more than just a good but average offering. It's a good game, but somewhat lacking. Still, it's worth a shot if you're into old school Power Rangers or the like. Give it a go.
Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie for the Sega Game Gear is a direct sequel to the first Mighty Morphin video game on Game Gear. In fact, I think it's safe to say that it's pretty much the same game as the previous title with a new coat of paint and a couple extra features here and there for good measure. Not that it's a bad thing, the original Power Rangers game on the Game Gear was a pretty solid and fast-paced fighting game that turned out pretty good, I think. And it's a game I would recommend anybody with a Game Gear to check out, whether they're a fan of the franchise or not. So with the second offering, Sega and Banpresto seemed content with offering more of the same kind of gameplay, and it's hard to blame them because that was a great game and worked well for the Game Gear. Much to the surprise of absolutely nobody, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie is still a very solid, well-made fighting game, albeit one that isn't as good as its predecessor, but that's really a minor point. Much like the previous game, you have 3 modes of play: story mode, versus mode, and link mode. Story mode is the main mode where you pick any of the 6 Power Rangers and fight off putties and oozmen before facing off against the monster of the week. Defeat the monster once and you get to fight him again in the Thunder Megazord or Ninja Megazord depending on the level. Similar to the Sega Genesis version of the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie game, story mode is split into 2 parts. The first half of the game pits the Rangers against monsters from the show, sent by Lord Zed, while the latter levels has you dealing with movie villain Ivan Ooze and his evil army of oozmen and ectomorphic titans. Unfortunately, the movie portion of the story mode is represented by 2 rounds of oozmen, 2 Zord fights, and a scrolling text of exposition that explains what happens before the oozmen fight and the final battle of the ectomorphicans. Lame. Versus mode is the generic arcade mode. Pick any of the Rangers, Zords, or monsters and face off against all the rest. The character you choose determines the number of opponents you'll be facing, as there's absolutely no chance of a Ranger facing off against any of the Zord types or vice versa, and there doesn't seem to be a hidden dream mode that you can unlock to do just that. Link mode allows you to play against another player with a Game Gear and a copy of this game. Pretty self-explanatory. Much like the previous game, the combat is pretty simple fare. You have a punch button, a kick button, and you can do a fierce attack when both buttons are pressed. You can throw, run in on your opponent, backflip away, basic stuff. Each fighter has about 3 special moves, all done the same way, depending on the button. So if you figured out how to perform moves on one fighter, you pretty much know them all. Basically, if you played the previous game, you pretty much played this one because it's more or less the same thing. Even the core 5 Power Rangers have the same set of moves from before, despite 3 of them being technically new characters due to being replacement Rangers. But while combat is relatively the same, Power Rangers the movie does introduce super attacks into the mix. On the corner of the screen, you'll see a little lightning bolt. It starts off dark, but slowly but surely begins to light up as you lay some pain on your opponent. Once the bolt is blinking, you can perform your super attack, which is an attack that does more damage than your usual attacks. Obviously. Pulling off special moves and quick little combos is pretty easy, although the stronger moves requiring both buttons pressed to execute may be a bit tricky but not impossible to execute. Controls responsive enough, there's no lag or anything of the sort. Moves execute fairly quickly and fairly well, nothing really to complain about here. For the most part, Power Rangers the movie looks similar to its previous predecessor. I sort of fumbled that one really bad. And there's honestly nothing wrong with that. The game looking like it did previously, not the fumbling part, because that Power Rangers game was visually impressive for its time, with fluid animation, incredible detail to the sprites and backdrops, and Power Rangers the movie continues that tradition rather well. It's nice to see some of the new monsters seem to look as good as their predecessors. However, the cutscenes that were great in the previous game aren't as much here, nowhere near as varied either. For the first half of the game, you have Lord Zed staring ahead menacingly. And then later on, you have scrolling text over Ivan Ooze's shadowed face. Yippee! Sound is another sore spot in Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie. I'm not really going to say much about the sound effects used since they're mostly recycled from the previous game and they sound well enough. The Game Gear interpretation of the Go-Go Power Rangers theme is almost a note-for-note recycling from the previous game, rather than go for a series of original tunes made specifically for the game, which might have been preferable. The game opts to take inspiration from its bigger Genesis counterpart, and uses some select tunes from the Ron Wasserman produced soundtrack, to rather rubbish results. The Genesis version might have done a better interpretation of those songs, and quite honestly, it's a considerable improvement over the first Genesis Power Rangers game's less than mediocre musical cues. But the soundtrack translated considerably poorly over to the Game Gear. I suppose some might appreciate the effort, but personally, I would have preferred they created their own collection of tunes rather than trying to butcher a pre-existing collection. Just like they did with that first effort, which had a pretty catchy collection of tunes overall, and they were all original tunes. Overall, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers the movie for the Game Gear is a solid follow-up to the first Power Rangers game on that console, maintaining the slick gameplay of that earlier title and adding minor bits here and there. The game itself is perhaps not as solid as its predecessor, with lesser quality tunes, fewer worthwhile fighters and backdrops, and a rather half-hearted adaptation of the movie it's named after, but still it's a well-made fighter, fast-paced, colorful, and if you enjoyed the previous game then you'll get more of the same with this one, and that's not a bad thing. That having been said, however, if you're ever given a choice between the two Mighty Morphin Power Ranger Game Gear games, I'd say go with the first game.
It seems to be the most common. There's a more varied cast of characters, the story mode's a tad more interesting, and you can unlock that pretty sweet dream mode that's well worth playing through the main mode. Just saying.